Okay, just imagine for a second you're given a task. Build a brand new country. From scratch. I'm not just talking about planting a flag somewhere, I mean building an entire society out in a vast, totally unknown land. Well, that was the incredible challenge Spain took on in the late 1500s, and it led to the founding of New Mexico. So, how in the world did they pull it off?
No, really, think about that. It is a huge question. You can't just show up. You need people, you need supplies, you need livestock, and you need a leader who can somehow hold all of that together across hundreds and hundreds of miles of wilderness. It is a massive, massive gamble. For decades, these rumors have been swirling around, tales of rich cities and huge territories to the north. So by 1598, the Spanish crown basically said, all right, enough exploring, it's time to settle. But to lead what was essentially a massive private startup, they needed a very, very specific kind of person.
And that brings us to the first and maybe the most critical piece of this whole puzzle, finding the right person to lead the mission to New Mexico.
So the order comes down from the king to the viceroy of New Spain, and it's pretty clear. Find someone to go settle New Mexico. But this wasn't a job for just any soldier. Oh no. They needed an entrepreneur, a governor, and a general all rolled into one. And the man they picked was Don Juan de Onite. And when you look at his resume, it's kind of obvious why. First, he had 20 years of military experience on the frontier, so he knew exactly what he was getting into. Second, his family was swimming in money from silver mining, so he had the cash to fund the whole thing. And third, his marriage. Wow, it was a political power move, connecting him to both the Spanish conqueror Cortez and the Aztec emperor Moctezuma. He was experienced, he was connected, and most importantly, he was rich enough to bankroll the entire operation himself. And that personal wealth was the key. Because this reveals Spain's whole colonization strategy, really. Outsource the risk. This was not a government-funded project. Oñate himself had to pay for the soldiers, the families, the supplies, the animals, everything. The government only paid for the friars. This was an enormous personal investment, a giant bet on the promise of finding something valuable up north. So, with his own fortune on the line, Oñate put together an expedition that was just staggering in its scale. I mean, this was not a small group of explorers. This was a whole colony on the move. It all started with the people. 400 men, women, and children, including 130 complete families who all agreed to leave their old lives behind and march straight into the unknown. And to feed and support them, they brought a herd of 7,000 animals. And this wasn't just food. This was the foundation for their new economy, their transportation, their entire agricultural future on the hoof. And then everything else they needed to build a new society, tools, food, clothes, all their personal stuff. It was all packed into 83 huge lumbering carts. Can you just imagine the logistics of keeping that moving? When this whole thing was on the march, it formed a massive column of people and carts and animals that stretched for over 2 miles. This wasn't just an expedition, it was literally a moving city. Now you're probably wondering, how in the world do we know all these incredible details? Well, we can thank this guy, Gaspar Pérez de Villagra. He was right there, an eyewitness who traveled with Oñate and wrote everything down. His book, A History of New Mexico, which came out in 1610, is the reason we have such a clear picture. And get this, it's the very first history book ever published about any part of what would eventually become the United States. Amazing, right? And Villagra's account makes one thing crystal clear. This journey was anything but easy. So let's talk about the long march north, a trip that was really defined by both incredible hardship and a whole lot of hope. Okay, so the expedition sets out in late January. It takes them 3 long months just to get to the Rio Grande. On April 30th, Oñate officially claims all of New Mexico for Spain. But they were far from done. It took until the middle of August for that entire 2-mile-long column to finally drag itself to its destination after a grueling 600-mile journey. And that journey, it was absolutely brutal. The settlers struggled through hundreds of miles of just empty land. They were constantly dealing with crippling hunger and thirst. It was a true test of human endurance. And just to give you a sense of the danger, there was one 90-mile stretch of desert with no water at all. It was so bad it earned this terrifying name, the Jornada del Muerto, or the Journey of the Dead Man. This was the most dangerous part of the whole trip, a real trial by fire they just had to get through. But somehow, They did survive. And that brings us to our final piece here, forging a new capital and planting the very first Spanish roots deep in the soil of New Mexico. So, on July 11th, 1598, Oñate set up the very first Spanish settlement at a pueblo that was already there. He called it San Juan de los Caballeros. But pretty quickly, within 6 months, they moved across the river and started a brand new settlement, San Gabriel. This gave them more room to build and also put a little bit of distance between them and the pueblo. And San Gabriel would become New Mexico's first official capital. So what were their first priorities the second they arrived? Well, the first two things they did tell you everything you need to know about their survival strategy. They immediately laid the foundation for a church, and then they started digging irrigation ditches. Their whole future depended on their faith and their ability to grow food in this new land. And so San Gabriel became the center of Spanish power in the whole region. For more than 10 years, it was the capital of this new kingdom, the little foothold from which Spain was going to try and control a huge new territory. So they'd done it. They marched hundreds of miles, they survived deadly deserts, and they built a capital city right out of the dust. Oñate had pulled off the first part of his mission, but the biggest question of all was still hanging in the air. Now that it was built, could this tiny colony, so incredibly far from everything it knew, actually survive? Well, that's a story for another time.